Hello everyone, and welcome to the 227th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring the characters and themes of Sinners. I don't have too much to say in this intro that won't be said soon enough, so I'm going to keep this short, but I will say that this film will no doubt go down as not just one of the best films to come out this year, but this decade, and even of all time, for it's as entertaining as it is powerful, heartwarming, and heart-wrenching. And if you're watching this video right around its release and haven't seen this film yet, I highly recommend you go and see it in theaters at your earliest convenience, because this is one experience that you're not going to want to miss. Now without further ado, let's begin. The human species has made great strides in overcoming nature and its laws. Most of us have long since left the trees and the caves for the safety of homes of our own making. For a good majority of us, food is no longer something to war over, but a convenience that's as plentiful as the air we breathe. We have become creatures who have transcended our base needs and trivialized them, so we might become something more than beings who are slaves to our thirst, hunger, and innate desire to reproduce. As true as that may be, and as much as we try to escape the perils of nature, as well as our own, in many ways, we are still beholden to our animal instincts and the various laws of nature. However, above all others, there is one of nature's laws that has defined the trajectory of not just our own species, but our entire planet and every organism who has ever lived since the dawn of time. The strong prey on the weak. The literal meaning of that term still very much applies to us in many ways. However, in typical human fashion, we have twisted this law, made it our own, given it a new name, and transformed it into something much more sinister. Might makes right. For thousands upon thousands of years, humans or human organizations with great strength have preyed on the weak and helpless amongst them or around them. And while morality has been a cornerstone of human society since it began, and is universal in many ways, what is considered good and what is considered evil can ultimately be decided by those with the power to make that decision. So it has been for every crime ever committed under the guise of expansion, conquest, colonization, and proselytization, where one man's holy war is another's horror story. The Akkadian Empire washed over the Sumerian city-states and made them and their people their own. The Egyptians conquered many lands that surrounded them and subsumed their peoples into an empire that lasted thousands of years. The Romans consumed nearly everything they touched and assimilated all that they crushed under their thumbs into their Khanate kingdom. And on this same story has been repeated throughout our history, even to this very day. The strong reap the benefits. The weak suffer the reaping of the strong, and the strong justify suffering by right of their might. And while this idea is central to understanding the evil present in this film, it wouldn't be were this concept not ruled by another law of nature that serves as the supreme universal edict that drives all others: causality, or cause and effect. Whether you're aware of it at every waking moment or not, every action you take, no matter how small, affects something or someone. You could toss a bottle cap in the trash tomorrow that then makes its way to the ocean and finds itself lodged in the throat of an unassuming creature who then chokes to death. You could rally those around you to revolution and topple your country's government and install a new one that will decide the fates of millions of people in great and small ways for generations and even millennia to come. An idea which this film encapsulates for us perfectly in a few different ways. The central evil in this story emanates from the actions of Remick, a man who, if his dialogue is any indicator, is somewhere around 1500 years old. But importantly, he's not just a 1500-year-old vampire, he's a 1500-year-old Irish vampire, or perhaps more appropriately, a Gaelic vampire, for the Irish moniker now assumed by the inhabitants of the Emerald Isle did not exist when Remick was born. After Sammy begins reciting the Lord's Prayer, and Remick begins reciting it with him along with his horde, he says the following: "Long ago, the men who stole my father's land forced these words upon us. I hated those men, but the words still bring me comfort. Those men lied to themselves, then lied to us. They told stories of a God above and a devil below, and lies of a dominion of man over beast and earth. We are earth and beast and God. We are woman and man. We are connected, you and I, to everything." Now these lines from Remick allow us to pinpoint exactly what time period he lived through when he was human, the period of time when the Christianization of Ireland was occurring. And to get a better idea of the possible time periods Remick may have been alive for, take a listen to this article that can be found over on Britannica.com that's titled "Early Christianity in Ireland." Little is known of the first impact of Christianity on Ireland. Traditions in the south and southeast refer to early saints who allegedly preceded St. Patrick, and their missions may well have come through trading relations with the Roman Empire. The earliest firm date is AD 431, when Saint Germanus, Bishop of Auxerre in Gaul, proposed, with the approval of Pope Celestine I, to send a certain Palladius to the Scots believing in Christ. Subsequent missionary history in Ireland is dominated by the figure of St. Patrick, whose 7th century biographers, Tirashan and Mirshu, credited him with converting all the Irish to Christianity and won for him the status of national apostle. A 9th century record, the Book of Armagh, includes a work by Patrick himself, the Confessio, Confession, a reply to charges made by British ecclesiastics, in which he describes his life at a Roman villa in Britain, his capture by Irish raiders, and his 7 years of slavery in Ireland. Recovering his freedom, he claimed he was educated and ordained into the priesthood, and eventually managed to be sent as a missionary to Ireland. He concentrated on the north and west of the country, achieving remarkable success. He did not himself claim to have converted all of Ireland. Confusion exists regarding the chronology of Patrick's life, and it is seriously contended that tradition came to merge the experience of 2 men, the continental Palladius and the Patrick of the Confessio. No sufficient evidence supports the traditional date, 432, for the beginning of Patrick's mission. Of the rival dates, 461/462 and 492/493, given for his death in annals and biographies, the latter is now preferred. So the advent of Christianity as the majority religion in Ireland was brought upon sometime in the 5th century, and so in all likelihood, Remick was born and lived sometime during the 5th century. Interestingly enough though, when I was researching this topic, I discovered that what accounts we have of the Christianization of Ireland don't really detail any sort of violent attempts at conversion. But just because we don't have a record of something doesn't mean that it didn't occur. And considering our off-violent past, it's definitely not out of the realm of possibility for Remick and his family to have suffered the forced conversion of a greater power that invaded their lands, be that a petty kingdom, the representatives of an empire, or a group of people that may have been akin to the Crusaders. With that in mind, I think it's possible that Remick may have lived during the turn of the 5th century, or possibly a bit earlier, when less peaceable men may have made their way to the island of their own accord to take what they would and convert whoever they came across before more peaceful missions were undertaken by members of the church. However, what might confirm for us a more concrete date is the fact that the events of this story occur on October 16, 1932, and that Stack visited Sammy exactly 60 years later on the same date in 1992. The article I read for you a moment ago stated that the years 492 and 493 are now more widely considered the dates when St. Patrick began his mission in Ireland. But traditionally, 432 was considered the date when he began his mission. So perhaps the men who came to Ireland and took Remick's family's land were the men who came there with St. Patrick exactly 1500 years prior to the events of this film, or even 1440 years prior to it, and 1500 years prior to the date Stack visited Sammy, if we go by one of the purported true dates, which could then possibly indicate that the very date Remick was turned was the same date that he unleashed horror upon these people 1500 years later. Regardless of the exact date and circumstances of what happened to Remick in his youth, the fact of the matter is that Remick once lived in what we now call Ireland, and his family's land was forcibly taken from them by men who wished to convert them to their religion, after which we can assume that wherever Remick went, following this expulsion, that he encountered a vampire that then turned him into the monster he was. Now if we fast forward give or take a millennia, we encounter another people whose lives, and the lives of their descendants, were forever altered by outsiders projecting their might upon them. The African people either abducted by, or sold to by their own brethren, various European and Middle Eastern powers, during the transatlantic slave trade, who were then brought to the New World. Slavery had existed in Africa prior to the arrival of outsiders looking to purchase Africans as slaves, and I'm sure that's ultimately what set the stage for a large population of Africans being sold to outside powers by the victors of various wars on the continent. And this then led to those maligned peoples being transported to America, where they were not only made to be slaves, but to adopt the traditions and religion of their overlords, which then led to the development of black culture in America. But why is the history of Irish Christianization and black culture in America pertinent to understanding the evil in this story? Because of cause and effect. Because evil begets evil. For if the ancestors of the people we see in this story hadn't been taken from their homelands and brought to this country, then they wouldn't have been in the situation we find them in. And if men hadn't come to Remick's homeland to take away his family's land, he likely wouldn't have been turned into a vampire and been there in Mississippi in 1932 to murder nearly all of them. A dreadful dance of causality that was centuries in the making. Thousands if not millions of things needed to occur for all the things we see happening in this film to even be a possibility. And because that's true, every act of evil that went into placing these people where they are in this story ultimately caused all the crimes that play out here to happen. But even though these things laid the foundation for the events of this film, there are various aspects of this story aside from a history of repression, colonization, forced conversion, conquest, and slavery that caused the horror show that unfolds here to occur. There are legends of people born with the gift of making music so true it can pierce the veil between life and death, conjuring spirits from the past and the future. In ancient Ireland, they were called Fili. In Choctaw land, they called them firekeepers. And in West Africa, they're called griots. This gift can bring healing to their communities, but it also attracts evil. These are the opening lines of this film, and they introduce one of the central themes of it, the power of music, and how its sound transcends race, creed, culture, and religion to bring all in this world together, for better or for worse. As much as each culture that has ever existed has created their own music, and those creations belong to them, the components of the songs they've created do not. A chord of a guitar, or any note sung by a person doesn't belong to any one culture. They are the building blocks of a phenomena that can stir emotions within all of us, no matter what language a song is sung in, nor which instruments are being used to create it. Understanding the lyrics of a song is important, but you don't need to understand the lyrics of a song to feel the rhythm in your soul, for rhythm transcends all languages to become a universal language that we can all understand. And perhaps most importantly, it is a mechanism that we use to bring each of us closer together, to fortify the bonds of understanding and community that enlivens us and adds ever more meaning to our existence, all the while being a window into our shared past and future. However, as good as music is not solely the realm of the good. For music has been turned to many an evil purpose over the course of our long history. And as the introduction to this film highlighted, music, even music made for the enjoyment of the good, can attract evil. Remick is that evil, and his rampage through this community is filled with traditional vampiric guile and charm that ends in the gory deaths and conversions of the many people gathered at the juke club, as well as the lovely couple we see him turning before he arrives there with them in tow. However, there's far more to Remick's character and actions than just magnanimous murder and mayhem. One thing that isn't really explained in Sinners is how and why Remick came to America. We're made aware of his origin through his dialogue, accent, and choice of song for his bout of musical revelry with his vampiric horde, but anything else about his story is left a mystery. Admittedly, extensive knowledge of his past isn't something crucial we necessarily needed to know when watching the film to enjoy it and his character. But when delving into the why and how of a villainous character, this type of information often helps us understand their character just a little bit better. Well, fortunately, if you head over to the Spotify page for the film, you can find some supplemental materials in the form of news articles that provide us some great context for not just his character, but other elements of this film that we'll get to a bit later on. Here's one from the Boston Daily Journal, an article that was printed August 1st, 1911, that alludes to Remick's arrival in America. Grisly discovery at Boston Harbor. Immigrant ship wrecked. No survivors. Early this morning, dock workers discovered the wreckage of the Celtic Hare, a ship that had arrived overnight carrying Irish immigrants. Upon boarding, they found blood-soaked decks, burned remnants, and a haunting silence. There were no survivors, and no bodies to be found. Witnesses reported seeing strange flickering lights and hearing music from a distance the night prior as it approached, as if an Irish celebration had been taking place aboard the ship. But the festivities must have turned to horror. The ship's cabins were destroyed, and scorched furniture lay scattered. Only signs of brutal violence and fire remained. As the workers approached, a local woman claimed to have seen a lone man fleeing the scene, his skin reportedly smoking as he disappeared into the shadows. The cause of the wreck and the mysterious disappearance of all aboard is under investigation by authorities. Seems like Remick was busy ruining a night of musical festivity long before he happened upon the juke club. And with this gruesome excerpt in mind, I believe we can paint a pretty accurate picture of Remick's story and his motivations from the time he was turned until the time he came to the juke club. After being turned in Ireland, Remick wandered his homeland for centuries, quenching his unholy thirst and terrorizing whomever he could. Centuries following his turning and his residence in Ireland and possibly elsewhere in Europe, Remick was inspired to visit new lands and hopped aboard an immigrant ship bound for America. And here he experienced something he hadn't felt in a long time. Life in all its glory through a vibrant community made up of his long-lost brethren. After observing their merriment throughout this journey, Remick was enraptured not just by the sweet sounds of music and joy he had forgotten, but perhaps the sounds emanating from a filly, a person imbued with the powerful spirit of song and dance, who either truly was one much like Sammy was, or was close enough to one that it brought the memories of tales told to him by his family over a millennia ago back to him that stirred his cold dead heart to beat once more. even more so when Remick perhaps caught a glimpse of the family he had lost as the filly played their powerful tune. So in a raging fury of joy and hunger, Remick slaughtered all of them to the last, so he might absorb their essence and regain for himself some of that soul that he was forced to leave behind so long ago. But feeling unsatisfied after his feast, he resolved to find a new filly here in America so he might bind and control them and all that surround them, so he could live out the rest of eternity basking in some semblance of the life that was once so dear to him, and perhaps with their power to pierce the veil between life and death, the chance to see his family once more. This would explain why the Choctaw were hunting him prior to his arrival at the Burton Joan homestead. For as we learned in the opening sequence, the Choctaw also keep legends of powerful musical individuals that they call firekeepers, and it was likely a mention of their legends that saw Remick hunting down the perfect individual for over 20 years before this story began, which then led him to the finest filly he'd ever laid eyes and ears on, in Sammy. Something this origin adds context to as well is something interesting I noticed about the scene where Remick has his horde dance and sing along with him to the Irish folk song, The Rocky Road to Dublin. When I saw this scene, it seemed to me as if Remick was a bit awkward when he began to dance, like he hadn't moved his body in that way in a very long time. And when he admitted to Sammy before his demise that he was alive before Christianity became the majority religion in Ireland, I found it odd that he would be singing a song that was written in the early 19th century to reflect the passions of his youth. It's possible that this is a song that reminded him of home that he had heard whilst traveling in Ireland, but with the knowledge that he murdered all these immigrants coming to America, I think the reason why he seems a bit off here and why he's singing this song is because he just learned both the song and dance not 20 years prior, and it's only now that he found the opportunity to experience what those people felt the night he witnessed them singing and dancing with a newfound community of his own, which is a bit ironic considering the song contains a line about banishing ghosts and goblins. Another interesting thing to consider here is that he may have taken on the name Remick after he murdered these people, for Remick is an Anglo-Saxon surname that was first recorded being used in or around the 10th century, a few hundred years after Remick's birth. And though the name is now carried by both Irish and English people, its origin is English, which Remick is decidedly not. So it would make sense that Remick is one of many names this man has gone by since his turning, and possibly even the name of the filly who he slaughtered aboard that ship. Now this is not your typical motivation for a vampire, but something Stack says to Sammy at the end of this film explains the tragedy of a character like Remick and why he so longed to create the community he had lost. When Sammy mentions that before the sun went down that day 60 years ago that day was the best day of his life, Stack agrees, and he goes on to say that that was the last time he'd seen his brother and felt the warmth of the sun on his face, and most importantly, that for just a few hours, he was free. Sammy, you're the one I came for. I sensed you. I want to see my people again. I'm trapped here, but your gifts can bring them to me. Remick is not just an immortal creature trapped on this earth never to see his family again, but a man who through his sins is likely doomed to not see them still should he pass on. And furthermore, the trapped existence he lives here on this earth is bereft of all things that make life worth living. For to be undead is to lack everything good and true about this life. Yes, you walk amongst the living, but you aren't alive. You're a monster who is but a slave to their incessant need to feed, and the dire hatred that burns inside you as you walk the world knowing that your soul may never rejoin your ancestors. A beast with no family, no friends, and no one to love or to love them, whose life is as cold as the purest glaciers, and as dark as the blackest of nights. And so this creature, who has unleashed untold amounts of evil over many centuries, is pushed to commit more sins still in pursuit of goodness. And for that, we can certainly find sympathy for the plight of a man so lost and so disconnected from everything he once was. But when faced with the blood of perhaps thousands of innocents that cakes every fiber of his wretched soul, that sympathy matters little. But Remick is not the only evildoer in this story, and the idea that Remick was chained by his status as a vampire leads us to Smoke and Stack, who were similarly imprisoned by all they had been forced to experience in their lives and everything they had done. Towards the end of the film, when Smoke is done eradicating the clan members who had come to kill him and his brother, we see a montage of Smoke reliving the events of the previous day over again in his head. But not just the entire day in general, the points in that day where he and his brother were rounding up all the people who they'd recruited, taking them to the club, and inviting in all the people they'd spread the word to. This is a powerful moment, not just because it expresses for us the immense guilt Smoke feels after the dust is settled, but for showing us that just as causality brought the African people in Remick to this land due to various insidious factors, so too did it bring all these people to that exact spot that night through the actions of these two brothers and the man who set them on this path in the first place, their father. When Sammy asked both Stack and Smoke at different points about their father, we learned that he was a vicious man who mostly beat Stack, the man who was the more fun-loving and carefree of the brothers, while Smoke tried to defend his brother from his father's wrath. One day during their youth, the boys decided to run away after their father had beaten Stack harder than he ever had before. But when they ran away, the mayor of the town they ended up in kicked them out because he knew their dad was evil, so he figured that they were too. Obviously, the sins of the father doesn't make a child who they are or predict their future, but trauma and abuse suffered at the hands of those who were supposed to love and care for you certainly can. And it wasn't too long after the boys had returned home that Smoke decided to end their father's abuse once and for all by murdering him. Perhaps to escape all they experienced, the boys signed up to fight in World War I, which exposed them to ever more horror and hardened their souls much more than they had been before, with the weight of all Smoke had experienced and done and had to become rattling him so much that he developed an anxiety disorder that caused his hands to shake when he was under pressure. Seeking to gain freedom from their horrid past, and perhaps in the wake of the death of Smoke's child, they sought to gain a fortune by becoming armed robbers, as we can see here in this news article, dated February 9, 1924, from the Clarksdale Herald. Bank robbery rocks Clarksdale. 2 masked criminals on the loose. In a violent midday heist, Clarksdale's First National Bank became the latest victim in a string of robberies haunting the town. 2 masked men, both black, stormed the bank. One took charge with smooth, calculated commands, while the other used violent force to control the room. "There was a moment when I thought I was seeing double," said Comfort Jenkins, a teller. "The 2 men, they looked so alike, almost like they could have been twins, but then the one grabbed me by the arm and yanked me across the room. It was all a blur after that." Security guard Tom Myrtlebank tried to stop them, but was shot by one of the robbers. He survived, but is not yet in stable condition. The robbers escaped with a significant sum, and no one else was seriously injured. Authorities believe the men may be connected to similar heists that have recently hit nearby towns. The robbers remain at large, and the community is left shaken. After a successful stint as armed robbers in Mississippi, the boys went on to Chicago, likely to escape the heat, and while they were there, they caught the attention of Al Capone, who they seem to have worked for many years. But becoming armed robbers, and then the employees of Capone, only caused the twins to descend further into darkness. For now, instead of taking up guns to defend themselves and their country, they had taken them up to enrich themselves and their boss at the expense of who knows how many others. After being employed by Capone for a number of years and receiving little reward for their efforts, Smoke and Stack decided to take matters into their own hands once again in an attempt to seize their fortunes, robbing both the Irish and Italian mobs to do so, if this last article and the presence of Italian wine and Irish beer in their club are any indicator. Gang tensions rise in Chicago. Irish mob and Italian mafia clash. Tensions between Chicago's Irish mob and the Italian mafia have reached a new high, sparking a series of skirmishes across the Windy City. This flare-up follows a period of uncertainty since the arrest of Al Capone, which left a power vacuum in the city's underworld. A source close to the situation revealed that the conflict began when a stockpile of illegal alcohol went missing from the Irish side. The Irish mob accused the Italian mafia of stealing the goods, which led to a series of retaliatory actions. However, a similar claim is now being made by the Italians, who are accusing the Irish of the same crime. With both sides now entrenched in mutual accusations, local authorities are working to calm the situation. The fear is that if the conflict isn't contained, it could escalate further. For now, Chicago's streets remain tense as both factions vie for control. As you all know, their actions then caused the twins to come back home to find their freedom and evade the ire of the people they'd stolen from. And it was the blood money they'd gathered over the years that allowed them to open their new club, draw in many of their friends and family, and lead them to their untimely deaths. For it's not just the actions of great powers who seek to harm others for their own gain that causes evil to blossom, but the actions that each and every one of us take over the course of our lives. And from that first strike the twins' father laid upon Stack's brow, to the first bullet Smoke fired in defense of himself and his brother and their right to freedom, an echo of what could be and what will be reverberated across the ether until it reached that fateful day in October of 1932. And whether it was the mobs they'd stolen from who came to deal with them, the vampire who came to devour them, or the Klansmen who sold them their property who had planned to come and eliminate them, the result would have been much the same. Despite all the evil that was unleashed in this story though, one fact remains constant and is emphasized frequently as we see this story play out, that no matter what happens to us, nothing can take our souls from us. Early on in the film when Stack, Sammy, and Delta Slim pass a chain gang, Slim tells the story of how he knows these men and how they came to be incarcerated. He tells them that he and his buddy Rice were arrested one night and forced to play for the police in the empty jailhouse they were taken to, who they were sure were going to kill them. And after that, the police got the bright idea to take them on tour, which then led them to a house full of rich white people. Slim goes on to say that these people had real money, that they played some blues songs for them because white people like the blues, just not the people who make it, and that these people were nodding their heads and stomping their feet and were almost on rhythm. Slim then says he spent all the money he made that night on drink when Sammy asks, but that Rice, he pulled out his wad of cash at a train station to pay for a $2 ticket, an innocent but foolish act that then caught the attention of a Klansman who had his fellow clanmates apprehend Rice, make up a story about him stealing that money from a white man, and then lynch him and castrate him for these false allegations. Now this story, while speaking to the horrors of racism and what such pointless hatred can do to others, is notable for another reason, because it emphasizes for us the horrid truth about people who seek to force evil upon others, that in bringing down others and attempting to rob them of their humanity to bolster your own, you accomplish the exact opposite. In this story, Slim echoes a sentiment that's more often than not meant to be comical more than anything. White people can't dance. But as we see a while after he tells this story, that in fact turns out to be untrue, for Remick does dance quite the mean jig for us. While that notion is still admittedly often true, in this context, it's more so important to emphasize that these people are rich rather than white, members of the upper class who in all likelihood never experienced a day of hardship in their lives and forced others to experience so much more, people who buy and sell souls, but have long since abandoned theirs in favor of allying themselves to decadent evil. And so it is that every person or institution that has brought down the lives of others for the sake of lifting up their own has lost their soul. That's why Remick, when he first came to the club, was only able to imitate a fraction of the soul that the people within sung with when singing a song like that. For that song wasn't an Irish song, but a blues song that he tried to lull and connect himself to them with. A people who shared many similarities with his own, as far as repression is concerned, which is evident by this lovely sign that once hung proudly outside the doors of many establishments in the past, the music of their cultures that inspires similar movements of the soul within us, and in his efforts to convince them that joining him would allow them to move past the impositions that were placed upon them by society. But when Remick went back to his roots and remembered some of who he was, the soul that he once had was on full display for us, which we see not just in his spirited dancing and singing, but in the way his horde revels in excitement as they experience his long-forgotten joy. But this is also why men like Smoke, Stack, and Remick become men who sow evil in this world, even after experiencing evil themselves. Men who had taken the pain that had been inflicted upon them by their own oppressors, and made their purpose and actions their own, so they might right the wrongs that had been forced on them, through forcing them upon others. The dreaded cycle of hatred and evil that not just harms those who were touched by it initially, but spurs those affected by it to take up arms themselves and unleash evil upon others as they move through this oft unforgiving world. However, as I said earlier, no matter how hard evil tries to grind us down, nothing can ever take our souls away from us. Not the twins' father, the European powers who ravaged this world in countless ways, the missionaries and the crusaders who came to take Remick's home from him, a vampire seeking to consume you, nor the disgusting and abhorrent men like Hogwood and his KKK, a fact that is reflected in Sammy's story in this film. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. This is the verse Sammy's father has him recite at the beginning of the film. And while these words seem to not reflect Sammy's journey in this film, they certainly do. Sammy had been urged by his preacher father to not take the guitar his cousins had gifted him and run off to play the blues with them. And once he had, Remick tried to silence his hands and his voice forever by adding them to an orchestra that only played for a dreaded vampire lord. But even after facing the devil himself, even after being urged to put down that guitar by his father, when he managed to escape said devil, nothing could convince Sammy to put that guitar down. The urgings of a father who meant well couldn't do it. The fact that his guitar was once owned by an evil man couldn't do it. And not even an evil man coming to slaughter innocents and absorb them into a sinister hive mind could do it either. We are tempted by men with gold in their hands and fangs in their mouths who only seek to drain our blood. by men who feign shared values with one another, who hold a gift in one hand and a knife in the other. And we are tempted by men who seek to lure you from your homes with threats of violence and death should you not be what they want you to be, or exist where they think you shouldn't. And when it comes down to it, they are the true sinners of this world. However, we are all sinners, but so long as our virtues outweigh our sins, no amount of sinning can rob us of who we are and who we wish to be. The music of our souls that is reflected in everything good and pure in this world. Music that makes life infinitely more beautiful, even if it may be used by and attract those who wish us harm at times. For to bask in the tones of something we all share that only brings us closer together is the surest way to make this world a better place and make great strides towards eliminating evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on sinners? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, my members, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially Elijah Kai VA, our Dark Lord channel member, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.